hopefully that provided a bit of context as well as visceral experience about the different challenges and what's going on in the Arctic region. If you want an actual video of what the North Pole actually looks like, I am a fan of Michael Palin's documentary series back in the 1990s, in which he goes from pole to pole, from the North Pole to the South Pole, as a way to kind of look at the scale and the context of the global system. I mentioned earlier that Russia had recently put a flag at the North Pole, which some states saw as a rather kind of bizarre publicity stunt and being possessive of an area that should be as part of the common good. However, if you go, and at the end of the documentary, Michael Palin goes to the South Pole, the U.S. does have a scientific base at the South Pole, and until recently actually had military personnel responsible for the running of this base. Now there's still National Guard troops that actually are Air National Guard that fly people down there. There's a recent interesting documentary that the National Geographic put together about the building of the new base that's there actually at the South Pole. And for those of you who are interested in one of the specific countries specifically related to the Arctic, there's more videos you can look at. Here's a couple of links for Canada and Russia, as well as the US, talking about one of their military bases in the region and how that's relevant to the Cold War context. I think I mentioned a couple of factors having to do with natural resources, indigenous groups, and how the weather is connected to the politics of the Arctic region. I think talking a bit about statistics here for a second, since 1980, the Arctic region has been warming about twice as fast as the rest of the world, which has really led to unprecedented sea ice. You see a decrease in the land ice and some of the sea ice in Antarctica, but in the Arctic regions really has been quite dramatic. I think there's overall consensus that this change is not necessarily going to lead to a militarized conflict between the major states in the Arctic region, but there's a lot of jockeying for advantage, thinking of the long term, as states, given the long shadow of the future, have incentives to do. And this growing sea ice melt has led to a couple of challenges that the documentary touched on, but that I wanted to mention. Of course, economic. It raises opportunities for increased access and development in an area in which it's been really hard to survive for most of human history. Military challenges in being able to patrol parts of the country's borders, as well as the opportunities for others to be able to have easier access to states' borders. Environmental challenges with the increasing shipping that's likely to happen in the Arctic region that increases the risk of there being environmental spills, boats going down, other environmental challenges. When you have more people living around there, things can go wrong. It is just technically difficult to be able to get people still to that region, as well as to be able to get information about what's actually there. So these changes and the speed in which it's changed has really caused states on their own to try to understand what's going on, but then also efforts to try to cooperate, to try to head off any possibility for some of the negative effects of these changes. One of the major positive possibilities, of course, is the fact that there are new resources that might be made available. Estimates are currently that there's about 90 billion barrels of oil in the Arctic, which just to give you a bit of context, so that's 90 billion. Saudi Arabia has reserves of around 250,000 barrels, of roughly 3% of what's in the Arctic. So the scale and the size of the resource base up there is just astronomical. It's by far larger than what any other country currently has at this particular point in time. Also, not just oil, natural gas as well. Over 1,000 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is bigger than the largest proven reserves of natural gas in Russia, which is roughly 40% of what is estimated to be in the Arctic. So I think the size and scale economically of the resources, natural gas and petroleum, is just absolutely astronomical. Those are some of the economic opportunities. The environmental challenges with this are quite dramatic, and there's been some really good documentaries by the BBC and others that have looked at the nature of the changing Arctic. As the weather warms, fish stocks are moving northward to try to get into waters that are consistent to what they're used to. Animals are also moving north. And with the decreased sea ice, it's more difficult for some of the land mammals to be able to actually reach them. You see that sad-looking polar bear there on the iceberg. Some estimates have polar bears becoming extinct in the first half of this century, so in the next 35 years. Others will have it a little bit farther out. So there's environmental opportunities through increased access to resources, but challenges due to how the living ecosystem will kind of move to be able to adapt to the changing system. We, of course, are part of this ecosystem, and there's a lot of population challenges that come from these changing wildlife patterns, as well as the economic, and political, and military realities that come with increased interest in the particular region. The documentary touches on some of these indigenous population challenges already. I mentioned transportation challenges. Some transportation will become easier because there'll be less ice. So the opening of the Northwest Passage, which explorers in the 19th century spent a lot of time actually trying to find. This can enable some shipping channels to be avoided, like off the Horn of Africa or in the Straits of Malacca in between Indonesia and Singapore and Thailand. It'll be easier for us tourists to visit, which there are already boats taking people to the North Pole, but there's also safety and environmental concerns with actually bringing a larger number of people up there, because, as I already mentioned, it's the number of icebreakers are scarce, and so if a boat gets stuck in the ice, it can be hard to actually try to remove them. Russia has over 10 icebreakers. The U.S. and Australia only have one, and the U.S. icebreaker is getting quite old, and so there's a risk of regular ships in this area being damaged, as the ice can change quite dramatically, which makes it more expensive for those search and rescue teams, as we saw in the video, to be able to access people in need. In 2016, Australia just invested in a new icebreaker. Unlike the U.S., there is an effort and an understanding in Australia that, given the location, there is interest in having an Australian icebreaker in order to maintain access and resupply and keep channels open to the Antarctic region. This area has some interesting changes related to governance due to the changing nature of it, but also just as an area of relatively recent exploration. There was a treaty that's been around for a while related to the Arctic region. The earliest one, the Spitsbergen Treaty in 1925, it actually came into effect, gave Norway the rights to a specific group of Arctic islands. Other countries have joined this, including ones that aren't even close to the Arctic, but it is important and relevant because it set up this kind of understanding of where international versus domestic waters are, set up a 200 nautical mile zone around these islands that has caused some challenges between Norway and Russia, but it also helps set the standard for increasing codification of what would be considered domestic versus international waters. And it's always a challenge with states trying to decide, do you work within the current system or do you just try to create new ones? With the Arctic region, with the huge economic potential there, is do you stick with traditional international security organizations like the UN Security Council, or do you try to create or go outside those to kind of say that it doesn't actually apply? This relates to the typologies of governance options that I already touched on, from bilateral cooperation to multilateral and international agreements related to the Arctic region. I'm going to talk about a couple of different efforts at trying to manage political, economic, and military issues in this region. There's been bilateral agreements, kind of like between the U.S. and Canada. There's a non-governmental organization in Inuit Circumpolar Council, which we're going to talk about, the Arctic Council, UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, and the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. Let's touch on each one of those in turn. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is an effort to try to create a non-governmental organization to help advocate and protect the rights of people living in this area. First met in 1977. It represents over 160,000 people. It has a meeting every 4 years. There's some videos online that go into more detail about it and the recent meetings that they've held, including one recently that just happened in the U.S. And really important to the motivations is that they say it is our right to freely determine our political status, freely presume our economic, social, cultural, and linguistic development, and freely pursue our natural wealth and resources. So it is a group's claim that across boundaries that they should have rights and protections politically, economically, socially, culturally in this particular area. The Arctic Council is a state organization, unlike the non-governmental Inuit Council, in which it has states that are bordering the region, and they take alternate roles in chairing it. It's more recent than the Inuit group. It was founded in 1996. It is not technically an international organization, but it's just an opportunity for states to meet, to exchange information, and encourage collaboration and cooperation. And it is the leading intergovernmental forum to promote cooperation about these specific issues, including environmental protection. And the members are the ones you see listed there that actually have territory either specifically in or nearby the Arctic Ocean. Most of its activities actually occur in 6 working groups. Let's touch briefly on them because I think it highlights the way that they had conceptualized in their organization's creation the different areas in which there might be opportunities or challenges towards cooperation. The first one is dealing with contaminants, pollutants, emissions. This is a pristine and largely untouched area, though that's changing, of course, and so there's efforts at trying to prevent pollution and contamination of the area. There's the next group that tries to figure out what's actually going on, learn more information about the environment in that region, and gather scientific advice, kind of like the IPCC, as to try to understand what's happening and what's likely to happen going forward. And the next organization focuses on conservation of the biomass, the environment, and the living resources in the area. The next helps prevent and prepare for emergencies, given what might happen if there is an environmental catastrophe in the area. The next working group focuses on things underneath the water, the marine environment, and the last one looks at how can the resources within this area enable development, but in a sustainable manner. So you see one organization of non-state actors, then working groups in an international forum, which is not a formal organization. The next level of international responses to this kind of changing environment, as well as the needs to try to regulate it, is the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. It was created in 1982. It replaced 4 earlier treaties. As we see in international relations, there's a building upon and a complication of simpler and more minimal treaties as time goes on, as an increasing understanding of the need for international cooperation, as well as the experience in actually working together. it basically helps define the fact that the continental shelf of countries that have ocean borders extends to the natural resources beyond the 200 nautical mile range of the Spitsbergen Treaty, up to 250 nautical miles for resources. Russia has tried to take advantage of that in order to try to define where their shoreline is, where the continental shelf is. The U.S. has not agreed to it, like it has the International Criminal Court or a bunch of other international treaties, and instead it relies on a number of customary laws. The Article 76 of the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea is problematic because when countries try to stake claim to a specific area, like Russia was doing with their continental shelf, the other states don't know about their submission and their claim until after there's been a ruling. So one country can have incentives to try to claim as much as possible and as soon as possible because you're not sure what the other states will actually do. Another international organization, not just a treaty, but an international organization that helps regulate the extent to where states' borders are and maritime operations of different states is the International Maritime Organization. It helps regulate international shipping, which now transports 80% of global trade to people around the world. It was created in the UN in 1948 in order to help set standards like the development of containerization as well as shipping safety standards related to international shipping, and its basic purpose is to try to create a regulatory framework to try to create standards. There's functionalist reasons for this to be successful and have states buy-in, similar to other functional organizations related to international air travel or to the post that I've already touched on so far. It has promoted the adoption of conventions, protocols, codes, standards, basically setting in order to create standards for safety and security related to all of international maritime shipping, but also that in the polar regions. And recently in 2009, it passed guidelines for ships operating in polar waters, both in the Arctic as well as the Antarctic. And it also acceded to a code for ships operating in that region. So it's the oldest effort at trying to create cooperation on the seas, which of course includes the Arctic, but it's also helped spearhead and developed information and standards for operating in some quite difficult conditions. And it also has tried to help provide security off the coast of Somalia and the Straits of Malacca that I already talked about. When I was moving, I learned a lot about shipping channels in the last couple of years when I was shipping a lot of my stuff from the U.S. And so my last shipment was last year, and I tracked with some concern the boat carrying my worldly possessions as it went through some of these different channels. So the last level of this international response to environmental challenges and opportunities, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, are norms. And I think overall the international system has evolved a set of norms to at least say that states are interested in protecting the environment, extracting resources in a way that's sustainable, and protect those people that could be affected by these changes, like the Inuit that we've touched on. Some of these norms help create some of the organizations and the councils that I mentioned a bit earlier, and they've had an effect at trying to establish information about what's going on, as well as new norms and patterns of behavior. However, I think the norm of environmental protection has yet not been fully internalized, so that states have actually tried to change dramatically what they're doing within states in order to try to prevent some of the changes that the IPCC and other reports have said are likely to go on in general.